Thanks. So yeah, before I get started, I just wanted to say that I tried to pare down on the shorter side so that there's time for questions. So if questions arise, I'm happy to be interrupted. Yep, all right. So I thought I would start off by just telling you a little bit about where I work because not very many people are familiar with it. I work at the Combat Capabilities Development Command Army Research Laboratory. That is our cool montage of promotional photos that you can't really see, but just take my word for it, it's very cool. And I thought the best way of describing what I do is addressing common misconceptions. So the first and most popular one is I don't work on classified stuff. So I don't know any secret things, though everybody at conferences asks me now. Never tell me something secret. I can't hold it. And not only do we work on unclassified stuff, but we're strongly encouraged to share our results. So we publish papers, we go to conferences, we're just like you. The second is that I'm not a program officer. So we're strongly encouraged to build collaborations, and we're very excited about that. And there is money for those collaborations, so that's awesome. But we also do our own research, which not many people seem to know about. And then lastly, I'm not a human factor scientist. So there's many lovely human factor scientists that work for the Army Research Lab, but I work more on the cognitive end of things in the Human Sciences Department. And specifically, we're working on sort of understanding cognitive frameworks in order to help develop technologies that would be rolling out in 5 to 15 years' time. And so the research that we do fits into two buckets, right? So the first is basic research, where we're trying to understand a phenomena, the sort of fundamental aspects that probably be the most similar to what some of you do. And then the second is our applied side, which can still have sort of a basic component to it, but the change is that we're trying to understand phenomena that specifically address needs that the Army has identified that need addressing, right? And while we often talk about these two bodies of work as two separate categories, probably because that's the way they're funded, I think that's a bit of a misconception, that really these should be thought of, this is an arrow, but really this should be thought of as sort of a spectrum, where basic research is sort of feeding into applied research, and the delineation between the two is actually not as strong as you might think. And so to illustrate that, today I want to start by talking about this conceptual or computational model of attention that I built during my graduate school years, and then transition into how I'm using that as a framework to develop work for the Army in a more applied sense. Okay. So first, just to sort of talk about what the broad cognitive problem is that we're trying to solve, I'm interested in visual attention, which broadly we think to mean is the set of mechanisms that select the important information from our environment. So for instance, imagine you're at a sporting event and you're looking for your friend. You might want your attention to focus in on your friend's face in the crowd. However, many of us feel this perception that our attention is being grabbed by this highly salient yet task-irrelevant distractor. And so in this scenario, that flexibility of attention to be pulled off task feels like a nuisance. However, in others, it could prove to be highly useful. For instance, when you're driving, you want that ability to be pulled off task in case something unexpected happens that you need to address. And so the goal of cognitive or one of the goals of cognitive psychology is to understand how this competition of items in our visual field plays out. And to address that, there's been a large body of work both in the behavioral side, where we have measurements like accuracy and reaction time, as well as in the electrophysiology side with EEG, where we study components like the N2PC and the PD. And so what I want to do here is present to you this model, RAGNAROC, which stands for Reflexive Attention Gradient through Neural AttRactOr Competition, which bridges these two large bodies of research, using those as constraints to propose a sort of underlying set of neural mechanisms that can account for the results that we've seen in previous work. So classically, the way attention has been studied in the lab is through this paradigm, right? A shape singleton visual search. So participants are told to find the pop-out shape. In this case, it'd be that square amongst these circle distractors. But on some trials, we're also going to present this highly salient distractor. And on those trials, reaction times will be slower, suggesting that the presentation of that salient distractor causes some sort of interference. And so what I want to do with the model is to understand how the brain is able to mitigate that interference in order to accomplish visual search and finding the target that you're looking for. So to start with, in the literature we have evidence for two different forms of inhibition. The first is surround inhibition. So here, this is when the visual system is inhibiting the area around in the immediate vicinity of the target. And the way that this has been studied is by presenting two sequential targets and varying the distance between them, so that when the second target is presented at the same location at the first, we have really good accuracy in reporting it, and then that drops severely as you move it into the neighboring area. The second form of inhibition that we found evidence for is selective inhibition. So this form is where the visual system is selectively inhibiting the area, the location of a salient distractor. And the way this has been studied is by first presenting a visual search task and then following that with a probe array. And what Gasplin and colleagues found in this experiment is that participants are significantly less able to report probes presented at the salient distractor location compared to the non-salient distractor location, suggesting that the visual system is able to suppress this location to a greater degree than any of these non-salient locations. And so to now just give you a brief overview of what this model looks like, we're using a rate-coded neural network using the O'Reilly and Munakata differential equations to simulate membrane potential. And the model has three spatiotopic layers that are organized hierarchically. So the first is early visual, so you could think of this as sort of analogous to V1, and that's going to feed forward excitation to late visual, which could be likened to areas like V4 or IT cortex. And then finally, that feeds forward into the attention map, which some research places possibly in the parietal cortex. And so as we move through these layers of the hierarchy, the receptive fields of these cells are going to get larger and larger. To dive a little bit more in and give you some details, so as I mentioned before, early visual, sorry, you can't really see some of these graphics. Anyways, early visual feeds forward into late visual. However, there are actually multiple maps within late visual, each tuned to a specific type of stimulus. So you might imagine one map tuned to a specific color while another is selected for a specific form. And so this is sort of a gross simplification, but it's meant to model the sort of increased specificity that you see in cells as you move along the ventral path. And then while there are multiple maps in the late visual layer, one of the big assumptions of the model is that all of these maps feed forward into one common attention map. And so there are two parameters that we can adjust in order to simulate data with the model. The first is the excitation strength between early visual and late visual, and you can think of this as sort of the bottom-up saliency of a stimulus. And then the second is the excitation strength between late visual and the attention map, which is sort of the model's version of top-down control, right? So these arrows would have different values depending on how, what sort of target we're looking for, right? We would upweight certain types of stimuli while downweighting others. And so activation in the attention map is really a product of both of these factors, a term we refer to as the attentional priority of a stimulus. So up until this point, what I've been presenting to you is really a simplified version of a lot of attention models that have already been developed. But what I'm adding here is really the circuitry of the attention map. So first, how we handle enhancement. When an attention map neuron crosses over threshold, it's going to send excitation down to its corresponding early visual neuron. That's going to increase the feed-forward excitation, entering the system into this sort of excitatory feedback loop, a sort of temporary attractor state of the system. Now, for inhibition, if we were only interested in simulating surround inhibition, this would be an easy task, right? We could just say that if an attention map neuron crosses over threshold, it inhibits its neighbors, and we're done. However, remember, we also want to be able to simulate effects of selective inhibition. And so for that, I needed to add in a new group of neurons called the inhibitory gating neurons. And so while I don't have enough time to walk you through the explicit circuitry of this, though I'm happy to delve into it in more detail if people have questions, it suffices to say that what these neurons allow us to do is selectively inhibit locations of the visual field that are receiving stimulus input. And so how this all plays out in the model,
Just so I don't lose track of the big picture here. So when you introduce like the IG neurons, is that a known neural class, or is that just a postulated part of a competition? Something invented or something pulled from the literature?
No, this is, I mean, there are inhibitory neurons, but other than that, that is as biologically inspired as they are. So to see how this all plays out in the model, if you imagine we present the system with two stimuli at the same time, but of differing attentional priority. And then if we look at how activation plays out across the attention map, you'll see that it increases at both locations, but faster at the location of the higher priority stimulus. Now, in the IG neurons, those in the surround and those at the location of the lower priority stimulus are going to become excited, while those at the location of the higher priority stimulus, you can't really see it, but these turned white, are going to become inhibited. And this will give us our two forms of inhibition, both the surround and the selective. Yeah?
So is this all location-based?
Yes.
Okay, I guess I'll wait till later to ask if there's something other than location-based that might be working as well.
Yes, so RAGNAROC is all location-based, but there are definite results out there that suggest that you can also sort of inhibit feature maps individually, and I can talk more about that later. But yes, this is not the complete story.
Okay.
So we've sort of walked through the architecture of the model, and you see how the attention map responds to a set of presented stimuli. So what I want to do now is to be able to map this neural simulation to behavioral metrics that we collect in actual experiments. And so to do that, I'm going to take our LV map of interest here, and I'm going to sum its activation at each time point, and this will give us an information accumulator that when we pair it with a threshold can give us accuracy and reaction time. And so now, if we look at how the model fits the data, you'll remember this pattern that we saw from the Mount study that showed evidence for surround inhibition, and you can see that the model fits that pattern quite nicely. And then similarly with this Gasplin study, for selective inhibition, the model has similar results as well. So now I've done the behavioral side of things, and I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about the EEG side of things. Partly because this model was explicitly built in order to bridge these two bodies of literature, and so it doesn't make sense, a lot of the things that I've built into the model, unless you know that we were also trying to account for this other set of results. But also, I think if there are people who don't do EEG in the crowd, EEG is a really important tool because things like accuracy, or measurements like accuracy and reaction time, are really giving us sort of the outcome of the competition, who won and who lost. But the temporal granularity that EEG can offer us, as we can get sort of a millisecond by millisecond account of what's going on, you can see that competition unfold. And so it provides us sort of another dimension of information to look at. And so specifically, I will talk about two components that I'm interested in simulating here. So if you imagine that I present this array to a participant where we have a lateral target, right, this square off to the side here, what we would find in the EEG waveforms is this slight negativity between contralateral and ipsilateral electrodes on the parietal cortex about 250 milliseconds after the stimulus array onsets. And this negativity is called the N2PC, and research has linked this with the sort of onset or deployment of attention. Now, if I present a target on the midline and now a lateral distractor, salient distractor, what we'd find is a muted N2PC to the distractor, suggesting that initially attention begins to deploy to that distractor, but then it's followed by this positivity called a PD, which has been linked to distractor suppression. Right, so this is one of the interesting findings that you can see with EEG. Because you have that temporal granularity, you can see that attention initially begins to shift to that location, and then that location is subsequently suppressed. And so now I'm going to use the same exact model as before, but instead of simulating behavioral measures, I want to use it to simulate EEG measures. So to do that, I'll take the attention map and divide it into two halves here. And divide it into two halves, and then sum the synaptic currents of each of those neurons across the halves to get me a contralateral and ipsilateral waveform that, when I subtract them from one another, will give me my ERP difference wave of interest. And so now I want to show you how neural activation across the attention map pairs with a simulated EEG waveform. So if I present the model with this lateral target display, what you see is that as the imbalance in activation across the attention map increases, so does the amplitude of this N2PC, because it's a difference wave, right? We're subtracting one side's activation from another. However, as inhibition kicks on and we have this inhibitory well, the net activation across the attention map returns to 0, and the N2PC shuts off, returning to baseline. And so one of the important insights that the model has given us is that the N2PC as a component has shut off, it's over. However, attention is still being deployed to that target location, and there's still quite a lot of neural activity. We're just not able to read it at the level of the scalp. Perfect. Now compare that to when I present a target on the midline and now a salient distractor laterally. So I enter this salient distractor as having higher salience than the target, but lower task relevancy. And what we see is that activation in the attention map grows at both locations, but faster in the target location. And so this leads to a muted N2PC to the distractor. And then once inhibition kicks on and we have our inhibitory well as our selective suppression at the distractor location, this leads to our PD here, where the distractor has lost the competition to the target, and we have an inhibitory spot there. Perfect. So now to demonstrate how the model can account for EEG results and sort of the extra insight that using this model and explaining these results gives us, I selected a set of experiments from Hillemeyer and Corballis, where in the first experiment, participants were given both color and form information in order to find a target amongst distractors. And what they found is that when the target was lateral, you get this very strong N2PC in response to the target. However, in the second experiment, this time participants were only given form information, so color was no longer helpful in finding the target. And in this second experiment, you get a much weaker N2PC in response to a lateral target. So the way the model would account for these results is that if we imagine the sort of attentional priority of the target and the distractor, in the case of the first experiment, when you have both color and form information, we're going to set those attentional priorities of those two stimuli further away from one another, indicative of a strong attentional control setting. And so that way, when you add in intertrial variability, even though the attentional priority is moving around, on all of the trials, the target is winning the competition and successfully being enhanced. Now, in the second experiment, when participants only have form information, they don't have color now, we would simulate this by placing the attentional priority of these two stimuli closer together, indicative of a weaker attentional control setting. And so now when we add in the same amount of variability, On some trials, the target wins, but on other trials, the distractor wins. And so it's the combination of these two trial types that leads to this weaker N2PC. And you can see that the model simulates a similar pattern that we see in the data. So that was target processing. Now I want to look at distractor processing. So the same two experiments, but this time the target is on the midline and the distractor is lateral. So when participants had both color and form information, we get a PD in response to a lateral distractor, which the model would account for by saying this is indicative of the target always winning the competition and suppressing the distractor location. But when we only have form information and not color information, what we find is a small N2PC in response to the distractor, which the model again accounts for by saying that this is the product of sometimes the target winning and crushing that distractor, but in other trials the target losing and that distractor actually being attended to. And then the model is able to simulate those results pretty well as well. Okay, so why do we even need a model? I feel that there is a time in every modeler's life where they begin to feel that they are quite cool for what they have made, but you should be self-critical and think about whether this is really adding to our understanding of the cognitive problem, right? Or if you're just like super chuffed about writing hundreds of lines of MATLAB code. Well, classically, the way we've studied attention is by presenting, targets and distractors. And then we measure these observable correlates of enhancement and suppression through measurements like accuracy or reaction time. And so a sort of simple way of thinking about how the system would handle this is to say, well, we would enhance targets and suppress distractors. However, the previous work that I've been showing you that has been performed by other labs has shown that this isn't always the case, right? This relationship isn't always one-to-one. And so we have to make it a little bit more complicated. And so one of the things that I've been arguing here is that this sort of midpoint that we should consider is really what attention is doing. So in the model, there are no such things as targets and distractors. There are only winners and losers in this competition for attention. And sometimes that works out the way you would imagine it to, where a target is enhanced and a target wins and the distractor loses. But in other cases, it works out the opposite way, and it can even happen that both locations are attended, and as we can attend to locations in parallel. And so whether or not a stimulus wins or loses is really what determines whether it's enhanced or suppressed. And so what RAGNAROC offers is sort of a nice framework by which to think about how this, and this is an arrow as well, sorry, everything is very bleached out here. But what RAGNAROC offers is a nice sort of framework to think about how this competition plays out and what are the factors that are contributing to it. Okay, so this is our intermission point. That sort of wraps up all of the work that I was doing in graduate school. And then I went to the Army Research Lab and I've started working there. And so now I want to show you how I've kind of brought this cognitive framework along with me to develop projects with the Army. Yeah,
Before you move on.
as it's an intermission.
Sure. So it's very interesting to see how you can generate predictions from the computational model for EEG results. I mean, I don't know anything about EEG, but that seems unusual to me that you do that. So I wondered, you're trying to explain certain known, ERP effects, right? And so, but have you tried to broaden it out and look to see whether you can run the model, take like the average potential or whatever from the two hemispheres, and generate predictions that of events that people might not have actually seen or looked for on EEG that they might think to look for in the future?
What do you mean by events?
Well, like a differential between the hemispheres or whatever. It's something in the space of things that are measured, but
Right.
instead of just what you're doing so far is sort of retrofitting old results, standard results.
Yeah.
You don't hear about a lot of prediction in literature, but maybe it's possible.
Yeah, so what I presented here is really the constraints that we use, the data sets that we use as constraints when building the model. But definitely we've used the model to then generate predictions and test those as well. So one of the predictions of the model, and Brad and I have a paper in JP General on this, one of the interesting predictions that panned out was, so as I showed you, the N2PC shuts off even though the model is saying that attention is still being deployed to that area, right? It's just that that excitatory bump is canceled out by the inhibitory well, and so we don't see it in the level of this waveform. But so what the model then predicts is that if you present a subsequent target at that same location, you will not see a second N2PC to that, because it's just arriving at the location of an already established lock-on state. But if you present it at later lags, after that lock-on state has had time to dissipate, you've presented some distractors at that location, you'll see a second N2PC emerge at around lag 4. And so we did this with an RSVP task and found just that, that you see no second N2PC at lag 1 when you're presenting at the same, in the same location, but you do see a second N2PC of a reverse polarity when you present on the other side of the screen. And then at later lags at that location of the first target, you do see a second N2PC reemerge. So we've sort of limited our scope in predictions to these two components of the N2PC and the PD, which is obviously very limiting because we only have two polarities to work with. But that's more because this is the model was built to simulate those components, and so that's sort of the only tools in its tool belt. So there's quite a lot of other components like the CDA, which marks sort of items being held in working memory on a lateral side, but the model doesn't have any of the circuitry or mechanisms that would account for those, or even the components that you see, like the N1 P1 complex, that is just sort of a stimulus popping on the screen. But yeah, it is a really rich space. Yeah.
So the term attention gets used in different ways by different people, and you started out with the assumption that everybody would be in agreement about what attention was, William James and all that. But maybe can you say more about how you think attention, what you mean by attention? For example, maybe there are other top-down phenomena that could account for some of these effects, or maybe there are learning phenomena. So I'm just trying to get the sense of the domain here.
Yeah, definitely. So I've sort of narrowed my scope of probing attention in just looking at a reflexive spatial attention. So really just the early processes involved in a stimulus appears and how is the brain reacting to that. So, and we would imagine that this is sort of the neural circuitry that informs saccade planning. So how you move your eyes around the screen, possibly. But definitely there are more endogenous forms that are going to have more different types of top-down control that the model doesn't incorporate. So here we sort of cheat by using this one parameter that's the excitation between the late visual and the attention map, and that's how we're sort of simulating all top-down control. So things that you've learned or priorities that you've set, and we've just bundled it all into one number that you're inputting into the model. But definitely it is an oversimplification. Yeah.
So this was just something I don't know whether you mentioned it, I might have missed it, but in the in setting up the model, you mentioned that by going to the late visual area, these late visual maps, one thing that happens in later visual areas is you get a certain type of specificity. Mm-hmm. The other is you get a lot of invariance, right? And one of those invariance is spatial invariance. Mm-hmm. But later on, at some point when you were, I forget whether you were talking about it's the attentional map. When you were talking about the attentional map, you said it sends a excitation down to the corresponding
early visual neuron. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so, so that's not going to be one-to-one. I'm just wondering how that's incorporated. fact that you have much broader tuning.
Yeah, so we don't have spatial invariance in late visual. We sort of fudge that by just having much larger receptive fields. And then because the attention map is now pooling, one node at the attention map is pooling over a large swath of the late visual map, these attention map neurons now have very large receptive fields or spatial receptive fields of their own. So in the model, in terms of the number of neurons, there is a sort of one-to-one connection between an attention map neuron and its like corresponding early visual neuron. But one of the arguments that we make for why you see evidence of surround inhibition in the literature is that if you didn't have surround inhibition, the excitatory bump that you see in the attention map covers a huge swath of the visual field because those receptive fields are so large. And so while it's cheating a bit, we're using the early visual layer as a way to anchor it to the true location of that stimulus. So because it's sending amplification down to that early visual neuron, only the early visual neurons, so sorry, let me start over. There might be a large swath of attention map neurons that cross threshold that send amplification down to their early visual neuron partners, but only the early visual partners that are actually receiving true stimulus input will have anything to amplify. And so in that way, the excitatory loop encourages the growth of the activation of the attention map neurons at the true location, while the other ones fall away and then are subsequently suppressed. And that gives us your spatial specificity at the really high levels of the hierarchy. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's where I went with it. Okay, so now to sort of move the model into a more applied direction. First off, so how does this framework help us think about real-world visual search? So as I've mentioned before, classically we've studied visual search in the laboratory by presenting these arrays, right? Where you have a target among distractors. And so all stimuli on the screen can fall, there are either targets or they're distractors. They fit into this nice dichotomy. And with this paradigm, we've learned a lot about how the brain performs visual search, and there's obviously 1,000 different iterations that you can do with these sorts of paradigms in order to tease out different mechanisms. However, in the real world, things can be a little bit more complicated. So if you imagine you're leaving your slightly untidied office to go to a meeting, and you need to bring the objects with you that you need for that meeting. The objects in this room don't completely fit into a category of target or distractor. And what the model gives us is a more sort of spectrum approach of thinking about attentional priority. So where will you search first? Well, maybe this highly salient yellow sheet of paper that you printed your report on is both high in salience and task relevant, so that's a definite high attentional priority item. But this sort of nondescript beige Rolodex is neither salient nor super relevant to what you're doing, and so that's going to be on the lower end. And so when we think about the extremes, we can imagine these items sort of being categorized as targets or distractors. But in the midst of the spectrum, things get more complicated. For instance, we have this water bottle here that you might want to bring to the meeting. However, its bottom-up saliency is not very high. Conversely, this parrot in a hula skirt is highly salient, very vibrant colors, and yet completely irrelevant to what you want to be doing. And so how the attentional priorities of these two items play out is a bit unknown and could vary on a trial-by-trial basis. And so what I want to remind everyone before I move on is that what I'm saying here, what I'm simulating here is the competition for reflexive attention. So the sort of behavioral correlate that I'm imagining is where your eyes are going to move as you're looking around for these items. Not that you are 50% of the time going to grab the bird in the hula skirt over your water bottle and head off to your meeting. There are obviously quite a lot of decision making mechanisms in the interim of what you actually bring with you. And so now if we think about this kind of complicated visual search, but in a military context, a soldier usually has a variety of different tasks that can change depending on what's going on in the environment. But sort of one key underlying task that they are always performing is having good situational awareness and monitoring their environment for threats. And with the dawn of augmented reality, we now have technology that might allow us to display helpful information in order to aid in this task, as it might be a secondary or even tertiary task to other things that they need to perform in the field. And so one implementation of this is what we call augmented target recognition, or ATR. And so you could imagine surveying the scene. You could have a highlight that sort of indicates probable threats or even locations that might need continued monitoring in this sort of complex and dynamic environment. And so having this technological ability now means that we have quite a lot of questions that need answering of how the human visual system is going to interact with these kinds of systems. So just a few questions that we've been thinking about. One, sort of most basic, is how do you highlight information and still maintain the user's situational awareness, right? We have a vast literature that talks about attentional capture, and we know the detriment to behavior that that causes. So how will we encourage attention to different locations in the visual field without pulling a soldier off their task? Another could be, what are the effects of ATR highlights on users processing scene statistics, right? So what is the consequence of drawing these discrete boxes around people? Are we interrupting the way we sort of naturally parse a scene, or the way we extract sort of fast signals such as gist or broad scene statistics in the environment? And then a third, what are the effects of these highlights on decision making, right? So what we don't want is just as a soldier sort of operating, just checking a computer's work. Instead, we want them operating in tandem or in sort of a team with the AI system. And so I just want to pause here to reiterate that I'm not a human factors scientist and say that there's an infinite number of ways that we could present this sort of information on an AR display. And what I really want to get at and what I want to understand is sort of what are the underlying cognitive mechanisms that would be interacting with such a display, and not, are squares better than circles? Is green better than red? Because the technology that we have today is not what we'll have in 10 years or in 15 years. And if we can understand the sort of cognitive processes that go on in the human brain, we'll be able to inform the development of technologies as those capabilities change and as we're able to do new stuff, rather than just sort of addressing technology as it comes into our hands. So one of the areas of this ATR idea that I'm interested in is how the visual system will interact with ATR highlights of varying certainty. So one possible implementation of such highlights, you could imagine that if the system detects a person with a gun, but they're in a US military uniform, we're going to highlight that person as blue. Whereas if we detect a person with a gun but of unknown origin, we're going to highlight that as red, as a threat. Now, because these scenes, again, are complex and dynamic, and really threats could be anywhere, if we detect a person and we don't know where they're from, and they don't have a gun, we're going to highlight this as sort of an uncertain threat, right? There's some non-zero probability, and the soldier should have this on a sort of a list of priorities to monitor. And so the three major questions that I was interested in asking under this kind of setup, and again, don't get caught up on the specific colors or the specific ways these highlights are being implemented, but more, how do we interact with these stimuli that are sort of giving us a probability of threat in the environment, rather than being discretely discretized into targets and distractors. So my first question is, how will attention deploy to these highlights when they vary in uncertainty? The second is whether or not the way attention deploys is context specific, right? Does it matter what sort of highlights are being presented in a particular environment? And then finally, does this pattern hold when stimuli are moving across the visual field? So in thinking about how attention is deployed to these ATR highlights, we'll have our three stimuli types, right? So the sort of model that we're working with now is, imagine you have an ATR system that has about an 85% success rate. So threats are, so a red box will indicate 85% likelihood of containing a threat. Blue has a 0% as that's a friendly, and then yellow will have a 15%. And so if we map out the attentional priority of these stimuli, we would put the highest amount of priority to our most likely threat, the lowest to our friendly, and then sort of a middle ground for this uncertain highlight. And now what RAGNAROC would simulate is that we're going to enhance this location of the threat. The friendly might not even get any activation in the attention map as it's such a low priority stimulus. And then because this stimulus loses the competition as it has lower attentional priority, but still has quite a lot of input into the system, that location is going to be inhibited. And so, and there's evidence for why that this will happen. So if you remember this study by Gasplin and colleagues that I presented before, where they had this search array presented to participants, and then they presented a probe array, we can divide that search array into three different boxes, right? We have our true target, our low salience distractor, and our high salience distractor. And so we would have the same breakdown of attentional priority, this time driven by sort of the task relevancy in the case of the target, but the saliency in the case of the distractors, right? This is a higher salient distractor than this one. Whereas this pattern is more driven, I'm proposing, by the sort of top-down controls of upweighting this uncertain target over this certainly friendly, this uncertain highlight over this friendly highlight. And so what Gasplin and colleagues found is that you have suppression at this higher priority stimulus relative to this lower priority stimulus. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'm still not getting the intuition for why the friendly should have more active, I mean, it's zero activation, whatever, but have more activation than the potential threat. So why is the friendly not a distractor? Is it because the friendly is highlighted?
The friendly, so I sort of left this at flat because when I was trying to show you the gradient in inhibition, seeing it and how I was tilting my graphs didn't really make it clear. But you might imagine some suppression at this location because it too loses the competition for attention, but that suppression will be greater because the suppression is proportionate to the attentional priority of the stimulus. So just as the suppression is greater for this highly salient distractor in Gasplin's study, we're imagining the suppression will be greater for this slightly higher top-down weighted stimulus. Yeah.
It's a related question, but I mean, I guess I don't totally understand the logic of where attention ought in principle to be allocated given different levels of threat. So,
right.
I mean, you know, from a kind of purely static point of view, the more uncertain something is, the more you should attend to it, you know, because you don't know what it is. So 50% threat would be the most interesting stimulus, 0 or 100% would be uninteresting because you already know what they are. But clearly, in this situation, that's not realistic because you don't care just what they are, but rather what are they going to do next.
Right.
And
so yeah.
it's hard to factor in. That's a very complicated decision process.
Yeah. So I've been sort of taking a shortcut in thinking about threat in terms of in what order do you want to address these stimuli. So if something is 100% guaranteed to need your interaction with, that should take priority over something that we only have a 15% chance of needing your interaction with. So just in how are you weighting things, whatever you're more likely to need to engage with, you would put as having higher priority.
Right, so that's what I meant by what they're going to do next.
Right, yeah.
So obviously that's why threats are more important to look at.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But that does interact in a complicated way with what's your current state of knowledge. And I mean, I mean, going back to Milton's question, so I guess I don't totally understand how that relates to the experimental situation that you're modeling. I mean, if it's where, you know, the targets are important in terms of how you can interact with them because you want to identify them, but,
Right.
but they're not going to do anything beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
The distractors are distracting only because they take attention away, but they're not going to do anything. So it doesn't map on that well to the.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, well, in both cases, right, in this target, you need to find the target. In here, if you're monitoring your environment, you need to find the threats, right? Like you need, so they need to be localized. So what is more important in localizing is the more certain of the threats. And so I would place that along the continuum of targets and distractors. I would place that as closer to targets. So yeah, but you're right that nothing in this paradigm is a true distractor. And in I'm going to walk you through the paradigm that I'm proposing, but obviously in the real world, the friendlies aren't even pure distractors because they might require your attention in a different sort of way. So this is kind of a contrived example in order to make it at all relatable to previous research, but as a first step, and obviously there's a sort of second step of a higher dimensionality of what's your particular task at this moment. Yeah. Yeah.
So one other thing, so Eileen asked the question about, you know, what you meant by attention,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that one thing to really watch out for here, right, is the paradigm that you're going off of is this exogenous attention sort of paradigm. And in things like the Posner cueing paradigm, you find that endogenous forms of attention, which presumably is what's on the left here.
No, so I'm only talking about exogenous. So this would just be I'm only proposing that this is sort of a reflexive response.
But then it would depend very strongly on the physical properties of the cueing. Right?
So in RAGNAROC, the reflexive response is dependent on both the physical properties and your top-down control weightings, because we know that exogenous attention can also operate on things like conceptual categories. So if you do RSVP streams and ask someone that, you know, beach scenes are your target or bathroom scenes, you're able to extract that at the same sort of fast latency that you would read amongst green. Or slightly slower, but within the same sort of wheelhouse of those mechanisms that are operating sort of within the first 300 milliseconds of the information being presented.
I'm kind of wondering if I missed something. So let's say you have a scene that, you know, like we've got threats and friendlies and potential threats.
Mm-hmm.
But in a real world scene, you can have several threats.
Yeah.
And it almost seems to me that you get enhancement of one threat against and strong suppression of another threat in the same scene.
Yeah. Yeah, no, definitely.
Because there's a single target kind of idea to this.
So the RAGNAROC's not strictly winner take all, so you can attend to multiple locations in parallel, but they have to be within some neighborhood of one another in their attentional priorities. So you could very well imagine that even if all things were balanced and you had multiple threats, that adding intertrial variability, one stimulus could win out over another, and then you would imagine very strong suppression of that second threat that you're not attending. Yeah.
Subwinner.
Yeah, and then we would have even more suppression of that losing threat than we would of our potential threats. Yeah. Okay. So the Gasplin results that I've been presenting so far, or is just that one study, but him and his colleagues have actually done quite a lot of these experiments with a lot of different metrics, not just accuracy. So one of the iterations that they did was a similar situation where you're looking for this feature target, but sometimes you're being presented with this highly salient distractor. And the other metric that they've used is sort of the proportion of first eye movements. And so this I thought was sort of more applicable or more easily relatable to Army applications, because that first eye movement that you make to address a stimulus is going to contribute to your overall reaction time to the situation. And so what Gasplin and colleagues found in this experiment is that on early trials, when participants were unfamiliar with this sort of experimental design, you had the majority of eye movements being made to the target, but the second most likely location was this highly salient distractor. But then, as trials go on, and participants are able to set those attentional control settings more strongly, that location of the salient distractor is suppressed, such that you're actually more likely to make an eye movement to a low salient distractor than you are to that high salient distractor, with obviously the target being the most attended out of all of the array. And so this was sort of the paradigm that I wanted to build off of and see if what they're manipulating here with this bottom-up saliency can be applied to where I'm manipulating more in the sort of top-down control realm. And so the paradigm that I'm proposing here, so this isn't work that I've done yet, is presenting participants with this array of agents where instead now of having the agents all different, to control for their bottom-up saliency, I'm using the same avatar just in different poses, and participants are told to find the avatar with the gun as fast as they can. And they're told that an ATR highlighting technology will be helping them, but that it only has 85% accuracy. And so on 85% of the time, that target, the agent with a gun, will be contained in the red highlight, but on another 15% of trials, it will be contained in the uncertain highlight. And so participants' task is then to find the agent with the gun and report whether or not the gun is pointed to the left or the right. And so what I'm imagining is that after doing this task for a long time and being and sort of incorporating the statistics of the ATR, what we'll find is that participants attend most strongly to the threat highlight and begin to suppress this uncertain highlight relative to these friendly highlights. And so again, these are just predicted results, as I haven't run this study, but sort of this is my thought process. Yeah.
So I'm getting, I mean, with this, especially because you're using the numbers 85 and 15, I'm getting flashbacks to the original taxi cab study of Callahan-Flintoft, where, you know, they're told that subjects are told that 85% that a witness saw the taxi was green or whatever.
Right.
85% likely.
Mm-hmm.
So those, I mean, there's obviously a vast literature on that type of task with an emphasis on people ignoring the prior.
Right.
First of all, I'm not sure how ignoring the prior or paying attention to the prior might relate here. I know you're trying to equalize the priors by having them all be equally salient, but they're not all in the same location. That could change the prior, and they're not all in the same pose. That could potentially change the prior.
So the poses and the locations of these stimuli will be randomized for every trial. And yeah, and the participants are told about this sort of probability breakdown of where the target will appear, but it's also what they're experiencing. So I tell them in advance just to sort of help them, my idea is that it will help them build those attentional control settings early on, but I actually don't expect this pattern in early trials. In early trials, I do imagine that this highlight, just because it pops out amongst the blue, will sort of be likely to also capture attention until they begin to experience that the target is most likely to appear in red. And so it's not just the prior, but, well, I guess it's the prior, but they're sort of also experiencing it in the experiment statistics, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So the 85% is a number.
Mm-hmm.
They're just told that number, but they all, as you were just saying, as they gain experience in the task, they're going to start to get their own model.
Yeah.
Of the true number.
Yeah.
Which they may or may not be anchored at the number that they're told. But I mean, you know, as the learning process is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So that experiment that I showed you before that Gasplin ran, he actually he plots the sort of ocular motor suppression over trial. So at first you have a higher probability of making a saccade to that salient distractor, and then around trial like 100, that begins to dip down, and then you become a below chance at making a saccade there. And yeah, go ahead.
But in that case, this is like, it's 100% reliable
Yeah.
or unreliable. I would be really, really surprised. I mean, I think it would be amazing if you got those results, and it might be a strong case for you, because what people tend to do is write probability match instead of what they should do. So even just from a normative model, you know, in this case, what they should do is first look at the red box.
Yeah.
My prediction is that they'll actually end up looking at the yellow box something like 15% of the time, even though they shouldn't.
Yeah. So that's definitely
learn.
yeah. So that's definitely a good alternative hypothesis, and I'm totally happy if that is the way it turns out. One, it means that RAGNAROC needs to be reparameterized, and we need to do more investigation, and so that's always nice. But two, like, this is the way we're setting, I mean, the ATR is sort of meant to encourage attention with that distribution, right? That it's most likely here, second likely here, not likely in blue. So if the visual system is able to sort of deploy attention in a graded fashion that way, then that's awesome, and that's something important to know as well. If it's not, and we are implementing sort of suppression of this like second most likely, but first loser kind of, then that's something that we need to know about, because that's going to be, regardless, the user is going to be perceiving or responding to a different collection of stimuli depending on which one of those is true. And so we need to know that before you implement it in the field. Yeah.
Just a clarification about the task. Is there any difference in your statistics between the yellow box and the blue boxes? So is it 15% like, is it more likely that the threat's going to be in the yellow box than in the blue box?
Yeah, so the way I have it set up now, in order to sort of maximize the trials that I'm interested in, I'm thinking of only having the target, if the target's not in the red box, then having it in the yellow box, and sort of leaving friendlies as true friendlies, which also kind of has a good applied side, because it should be easiest for us to be able to build an ATR that's able to accurately identify friendlies, because we're sort of in charge of what friendlies wear and what technology they have on them. So those are my...
So they shouldn't suppress the yellow box. That is where they're most likely to find it if it's not in the red box.
Yeah, so if they are sort of the ideal observer, they will not suppress the yellow box, but RAGNAROC will say they will. Yeah.
And so I guess the difference between your proposed thing and the previous thing is that the only difference between the target, well, the difference between the target and the distractor is the color, but then the side distractors, the circle ones on the right and left there, are the same color as the target.
Mm-hmm.
So why would you expect in this one where the only difference is the color that they would look at the blue ones at all, because they know it's never going to be there, and it's like different. I think it seems more saliently different from the target in the original experiment.
Yeah, that is true.
I mean,
Yeah.
like they were just saying that they would maybe still look at the yellow one, but the blue one, there's no rational reason to.
Yeah. You're right. Yeah, the green is shared with the target and the low salient distractors there. I don't know. I might need to build in some catch trials where they appear in the blue just to up the ante with blue sometimes. Yeah.
Just as a general thing, so you have a right or left facing gun.
Mm-hmm.
And in the most salient or second, you know, like the minor salient.
Yeah.
Are you thinking of putting guns in the other ones that need to be completely ignored?
So right now, the way I've set it up is that it's just if they have a gun. But the other sort of implementation of this that we've been thinking about is sort of following the kind of rules of engagement of like, it's okay if an agent has a gun, but if an agent is pointing a gun, then that's a threat. So that's sort of another option that we can look at to help kind of balance out the kind of feature space of threats and non-threats. They both have this object. It's just sort of about the orientation of it. Yeah. Okay, so that's the first question. The second question that I'm interested in is whether or not this is context dependent. So the reason that RAGNAROC would predict suppression at this uncertain highlight is because it loses the competition of attention with this certain highlight or more certain highlight, right? And so inhibition is the sort of consequence of enhancement of it at a different location. But Gasplin and colleagues who did this sort of massive experimental data set that I'm drawing off of, they explain their results through the signal suppression theory, where they propose that stimuli release a saliency signal, and when you learn the salient distractor, you then are able to suppress that salient distractor. And so both models are able to account for the selective suppression results, but they're attributing the suppression to different mechanisms. And where this distinction matters is that if you imagine, what happens when the target or the highly certain highlight is not present. Well, RAGNAROC would suggest that because this now uncertain highlight is the most probable threat in the or has the highest attentional priority in this array, we're going to enhance this location now. Whereas we were suppressing it before when the certain highlight, red highlight, was present. Whereas the signal suppression theory would say that because this yellow highlight has been sort of learned as a salient distractor, we're going to always suppress that location. And so the two theories have sort of differing predictions of what would happen when you remove that target stimulus. Have you learned yellow and so you'll always suppress it, or is yellow being suppressed and really just the consequence of the target being present in other trials? And so obviously, depending on which theory is correct in these predictions, has different consequences for users, soldiers wearing ATR, right? So in this scenario, this is now the most likely threat, and so we'd want soldiers to be enhancing that location. However, if they've sort of been presented this highlight in conjunction with very certain highlights and sort of learned it as a salient distractor that they are now reactively inhibiting, this is going to be a problem and will, when it's presented alone and we actually need them to be attending to it. And then lastly, does the suppression hold when stimuli are moving? So all of the experiments that I've presented to you thus far, the stimuli are all static. The search arrays are static. However, as I said before, soldiers are operating in a complex and dynamic environment where things are moving around. And so do the attentional suppression effects that we see with static arrays, do they apply when things are moving about? So a second block of this experiment that I'm thinking about is having these sort of figures, and this is a choppy PowerPoint version of it, but having them move around and seeing whether or not that suppression, if we see it in the static version, tracks with a moving stimulus. So the dynamics of RAGNAROC are such that enhancement will follow a target around, and it will actually extend the sort of window of that lock-on because you're sort of exciting new neurons as you move it around. And suppression will similarly follow a suppressed stimulus. However, there's a lot of reasons to think that this is not going to be the case, right? And this is a shortcoming of the model. One being that RAGNAROC is a model of reflexive attention, so it's not parameterized for longer timescales. And you might imagine that having arrays move about will cause participants to need longer to engage with the array, allowing for more endogenous mechanisms to sort of override the reflexive response. Second, we know that motion is a highly salient feature that's capable of inducing capture, and we don't have anything in the model that makes motion special. So this could be something that disrupts the inhibition as well. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we might be using endogenous mechanisms of tracking these things that apply enhancement where suppression would otherwise have been. And so that's kind of the experiment that I'm thinking about, or that I'm proposing with the Army right now, and how I've been sort of using RAGNAROC to inform its development. And I intentionally sort of ended on this last note about the moving stimuli, because I think that portion of the experiment really asked the question about whether or not these suppressive effects matter outside the laboratory, right? It's not often that we are monitoring our environments and stimuli are completely still. So do the effects that we're seeing, do they translate to the real world? And so this is, again, an arrow. And so I started this talk talking about how basic and applied research really fall along this continuum, with basic informing applied. But what I'll end with is this idea that applied work can also sort of feed back into basic, where as we push our experimental paradigms closer to real-world parameters, we're able to test these models and then sort of begin the iterative process over again. And it's particularly important to consider how the things in the natural environment operate, as these are the conditions that the visual system was developing for. So you sort of have to put a check on how unnatural your stimulus or situations are. Well, it's really important that we've teased apart that these mechanisms exist. If they are sort of overridden by other things when objects are moving around, we have to know about that as well if we really want to understand how vision is working. And then lastly, sort of having an appreciation for this can help the sort of efficient development and parameterization of these models as we go forwards. And that is everything I have. Yeah.
I'm curious about something.
Mm-hmm.
Speculative, I guess.
Yeah.
But that's the fun part. So you talked about the model is it incorporates like gradients of saliency and relevance.
Mm-hmm.
And then the experiment, your proposed experiment, it's categorical. So you have whatever heads-up display that's giving you marking out this is a threat, and this is maybe like second degree, and this is friendlies. So I'm kind of curious, like, what if you had a system that was actually gradient, where it's maybe like intensity marking, like really bright, less bright,
Yeah.
dim, sort of thing. Would you expect something similar, so that you get suppression to like the second most active, like the second most intense object in the visual field?
Yeah, so I'm smiling because this is thinking about highlights on a continuum is something we talk about like every week. So well done. But yeah, no, so I think that is a really good next step. So the reason I started with this is sort of moving away from a target and distractor to like, a third level, putting 3 boxes in there. But as you say, I am arguing that it's sort of along this continuum. The reason that I wanted to start with sort of still keeping in discretized categories, but, varying their levels is because I would imagine that so RAGNAROC would predict, whoever's the sort of first loser is suppressed, and winner is enhanced. But if you're presenting things along a true spectrum, like varying intensity, I think you're going to have a lot more noise in the system, and have to worry about things like just noticeable differences, you know what I mean? Like how you're actually perceiving what is, and categorizing second best. And so I would predict the same effects, but I would maybe need a lot more trials or a lot more subjects in order to get the power to see those, because they're going to be muddied by those things, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I was going to ask a question that you sort of, I think you made moot, because I was going to ask about, most of this is set up like the plots that you were showing us were for first fixations.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this ties into something you sort of mentioned at the end, which is about in the real world, why is it important? So the other part of this, right, I don't know whether I'm not on top of this literature, right, but whether you guys have done experiments in which you use those same displays, but let's say the oriented lines are much finer, and you have to fixate in order to be able to discriminate.
Yeah.
And then, so then the second question is, if you present the display, make the people fixate, and then wait a second before they make a fixation or a staccato. My assumption is that in that case, this falls apart
Mhm.
because the saliency is no longer driving. So the question that's tied to this all has to do with the dynamics. I was going to ask a question about dynamics.
Yeah.
What would happen with the second fixation? But I guess my bigger question is, another thing that is artificial about the laboratory experiments versus the real world experiments beyond the motion is the fact that scenes don't just appear, right?
Yeah.
So there's a scene, most things are relatively stable in that scene, and so in that context, like if you have these highlights, there might be a new highlighted box that comes in, but beyond that, it's something that's sort of up for a long time.
Yeah.
So I guess what effect do you think that would have on the the predictive on the predictive strength of the RAGNAROC model?
Yeah. So RAGNAROC is parameterized just for that initial reflexive response, and because we know things like, so if you present a target, you deploy attention to it, you get an N2PC, but attention does not remain at that target indefinitely, right? You're able to sort of reroute attention, you get freed up after a point. And so the time course of RAGNAROC is such that if you just leave a target on, what happens is that lock-on state is established, it's enhanced, the inhibitory well is there, but if that target just remains, the neurons, there's another layer of inhibitory neurons paired with the late visual neurons that will sort of shut that location off after a while. And so that lock-on state dies out even if that stimulus is still there. So for your question of, what happens if you present an array and don't allow someone to respond to it until a second later, what I would imagine is the sort of enhancement and suppression landscape has now kind of mellowed out and is sort of back to baseline, and you would have more endogenous forms of attention that I would imagine would fall along the gradient of, first look at the most probable, then the second, then the friendlies or whatever. So that's definitely a limitation. And yeah, things don't abruptly onset. So the way I've kind of been conceptualizing how this might apply is one of the sort of features of all of these systems that we often think about is allowing the user to sort of turn it on and turn it off when they need. So it might not always be necessary for you to be wearing a turned on ATR system in an environment, but you might enter a scene and then want that AI assistance. And so if you imagine sort of flicking that on and these boxes appearing, this is how I am selling it as still pertinent, even though I'm only modeling these very early stages of attention. But it definitely is interesting how that interacts with sort of your ability to override this at later time points, yeah.
There's another really interesting, this isn't a question, this is sort of like a comment, but there's an interesting and sort of tangentially related literature on these computer-aided detection. Do you know about this?
Yeah, for radiologists, yeah.
But there's this like repeated finding that when you actually deploy these systems, you get a bunch more false alarms, but performance doesn't really improve.
Yeah, so Gabriella actually has been doing work with Traft and Drew and people at University of Utah who have done a lot of this radiology work. And yeah, we're trying to do better than that. But yeah, and I mean, I think they've already sort of accumulated a wealth of knowledge of the fact that attentional capture and sort of satisfaction of search, all of these things that are compounded when you add in these highlights. And so now we have this landscape of how do you implement it the right way, and then it's almost a more complex task because these are not sort of static images of a CT scan where you have all day to, or you don't have all day, I'm sorry, radiologists are very important and they've got very tight schedules. But how do you do this when you have dynamic scenes, when you have, often this sort of monitoring of threats is maybe not the primary task. Maybe soldiers are doing something else, but they need to be aware of their surroundings. And so it's, yeah, it's tricky stuff. Mhm.
So, I mean, another really interesting aspect that you bring up about when you put this whole setup into a moving scene, I mean, that obviously complicates it in many ways, and I'm just picking one way. But one is that, like, let's say, as Moses implied, you're not just planning a single eye movement or something, but a whole sequence of future behavior. So let's say you're gonna, you see a bunch of targets, or the targets have various degrees of probability, and you're gonna program a sequence of eye movements, head movements, whatever it is, to inspect them.
Mm-hmm.
But as time progresses, the situation is rapidly changing. I mean, how rapidly depends on the nature of the situation. But so you look at the first one based on some calculation that you might be modeling here,
Mm-hmm.
but then instead of moving on to the next one, to some extent you have to reevaluate before moving on to the next one. So there's some complicated interaction between planning and new acquisition of information.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the dynamics of the probabilities just become super complicated. I mean, that, for what an ordinary person is doing in a complex dynamic situation is complicated enough.
Yeah.
But if you add these additional exogenous cues like the highlighting, then I mean, it just becomes a whole new world of how to model what they're doing, or how what the display is doing might improve what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess this is also just complicated. It seems super complicated.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really rich problem space, which is good because I like my job and I want to keep doing it. So it's nice when things don't wrap up really easily. But I think our sort of approach is sort of thinking about how to make sort of strategic probes in finding sort of robust mechanisms that will affect the development of these technologies. And so the way I've been thinking about this is sort of, if you wanted to optimize a system, you want to sort of find that maximum likelihood, but you obviously can't graph out the whole landscape. And so how do you find, you sort of pick specific probes, and then as the technology develops, it will sort of shift us along that landscape, depending on what technology is available, will sort of shift us along that landscape. And so our job now is sort of a vanguard of plotting out, how the visual system is responding in certain constraints and being able to slightly extrapolate outside of those. And we'll have sometimes disparate, but these little sort of islands of knowledge to make sort of more general claims about how that landscape operates, and then how to optimize it depending on what kind of chunk the technology has put us in. But yeah, it's really complicated.
Well, thank you.